For simple words that turned a routine Tuesday afternoon into the most expensive mistake an airline crew would ever make. But let me back up, because what happened in the moments before those words were spoken will make your blood boil. Picture this: a man in worn jeans, a faded university sweatshirt, and beat-up sneakers walking through Miami International Airport. Nothing about him screams wealth, no designer luggage, no entourage, no flashy jewelry. Just another tired traveler trying to catch a flight home. His name was Marcus Washington, and he had just spent 3 days in Miami finalizing the purchase of his 5th private jet. Not because he needed it, but because his aviation company, Skyline Corporate, had grown so massive that his fleet couldn't keep up with demand. At 42 years old, Marcus was worth $2.3 billion, owned the largest private aviation company on the East Coast, and had just closed a deal that would make him one of the most powerful men in commercial aviation. But standing in line at Gate B12, nobody knew that, and that's exactly how he preferred it. You see, Marcus had learned long ago that traveling in disguise gave him something money couldn't buy: the truth about how people really behaved when they thought no one important was watching. And today, that truth was about to cost someone everything. The flight to Atlanta was supposed to be simple. Marcus had booked first class under his personal name, not his company's, and chose to fly commercial instead of taking one of his own jets because he wanted to study the competition. What he didn't expect was to become the center of a confrontation that would expose everything wrong with how some people viewed success, respect, and power. As boarding began, Marcus noticed the usual first-class crowd: business executives in expensive suits, a celebrity he recognized from a recent movie, and a young man in his late 20s with perfectly styled blonde hair, designer clothes, and an attitude that filled the cabin before he even sat down. The young man's name was Bradley Whitmore III, son of a prominent real estate developer, and he carried himself like someone who had never heard the word no in his entire privileged life. He was used to getting what he wanted when he wanted it, and today what he wanted was seat to A, the exact seat Marcus had booked months in advance. Marcus settled into his seat, pulled out a worn paperback novel, and tried to ignore the commotion a few rows behind him. But some things, once they start, become impossible to ignore. "Excuse me, sir," the voice belonged to a flight attendant with nervous eyes and a forced smile. "I'm going to need you to move to a different seat." Marcus looked up from his book, confused. "I'm sorry, what?" "There's been a mix-up with the seating assignments. Another passenger needs this particular seat, and we'd like to accommodate him." Behind the flight attendant stood Bradley, arms crossed, smirking like he was watching a chess game he'd already won. "This is my assigned seat," Marcus said calmly, showing his boarding pass. "I booked it 3 months ago." The flight attendant's smile became even more strained. "Yes, sir, I understand, but this gentleman is a Platinum Elite member, and he specifically requested this seat. We have another first-class seat available for you in row 4. Marcus glanced at Bradley, who was now openly grinning. "And what makes his membership more important than my confirmed reservation?" "Well, he flies with us frequently, and we like to take care of our most valued customers." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus felt something shift inside him, not anger, not yet, but a cold recognition of what was really happening here. This wasn't about seating charts or airline policies. This was about assumptions, about what people saw when they looked at him versus what they saw when they looked at Bradley. "I see," Marcus said quietly, "and you think he's more valuable than me." The flight attendant hesitated, clearly realizing she was treading on dangerous ground. "Sir, it's not about value, it's about accommodating our frequent flyers." "Actually," Bradley interjected, his voice dripping with entitlement, "it is about value. Some people belong in first class and others ... Well, others should be grateful they're not in coach." The cabin went silent. Other passengers turned to stare. Marcus felt every eye on him, waiting to see if he would back down, move to the back, accept his place. That's when Marcus smiled. Not the angry smile of someone about to explode, but the calm, dangerous smile of someone who was about to teach the most expensive lesson of Bradley's life. "You know what?" Marcus said, closing his book and standing up. "You're absolutely right. Some people do belong in first class." He looked directly at Bradley. "And some people think they belong there just because daddy pays their bills." Bradley's face flushed red. Excuse me, do you know who I am? Should I? Marcus asked innocently. I'm Bradley Whitmore. My family owns half the commercial real estate in this city. We're worth more than you'll ever see in your lifetime. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Impressive, real estate's a good business. I dabble in it myself. He paused, his smile growing wider, along with a few other ventures. The flight attendant tried to intervene. Gentlemen, please, we need to resolve this seating issue so we can depart on time. Oh, we'll resolve it, Marcus said, but first, I'm curious about something. He turned back to Bradley. You said some people belong in first class. What exactly do you think qualifies someone for that privilege? Bradley laughed harshly. Money, success, connections. Things you wouldn't understand. Try me, Marcus said softly. Look at yourself, Bradley gestured dismissively. Walmart clothes, no watch worth mentioning, flying alone with no assistant. You probably saved up for months just to afford this ticket. Meanwhile, I could buy this entire plane if I wanted to. The entire plane, Marcus raised an eyebrow. That's interesting. What do you think this aircraft is worth? Bradley shrugged arrogantly. I don't know. Maybe 40, 50 million. Pocket change for someone like me. Marcus pulled out his phone and made a quick call. Jennifer, yeah, it's me. Can you pull up the specs on the 737 to 800 we're looking at for the Miami route? The one we were discussing this morning. He listened for a moment, then smiled. Perfect, yes, I'll call you back. He hung up and looked at Bradley. Actually, a plane like this, fully loaded, premium configuration, runs about 65 million. But you're close, so, Bradley said. Like I said, pocket change for some people. Yes, Marcus agreed. The question is, are you one of those people? What happened next would be replayed on social media millions of times and become the stuff of legend in aviation circles. Marcus calmly reached into his carry-on bag and pulled out a leather portfolio. From it, he extracted a single sheet of paper and handed it to the flight attendant. Ma'am, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. Could you please verify the ownership documents for this aircraft? The flight attendant took the paper and her face went white as she read. She looked up at Marcus, then down at the paper, then back at Marcus again. I don't understand, she stammered. What does it say? Bradley demanded, snatching the paper from her hands. As he read, his arrogant smirk faded, replaced by confusion, then disbelief, then something approaching panic. This can't be right, he said, his voice cracking slightly. What can't be right? Another passenger called out. Marcus addressed the entire cabin, his voice carrying clearly. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption. Let me introduce myself properly. My name is Marcus Washington, and I'm the CEO of Skyline Corporate Aviation. He paused, letting that sink in. We acquired this aircraft 6 months ago as part of our commercial partnership with this airline. Technically speaking, you're all flying on one of my planes? The silence was deafening. Bradley stared at the document in his hands like it might burst into flames. Marcus continued, his voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel. Now, Mr. Whitmore, you were saying something about being able to buy this plane. Because I'm curious, if you could afford a $65 million aircraft, why exactly are you fighting over a seat that costs less than $1,000? Bradley's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The flight attendant looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Furthermore, Marcus said, his voice growing stronger, you suggested that I don't belong in first class because of how I'm dressed and what I own. Let me ask you this, what exactly do you think qualifies you for first class, other than your father's money and your apparent belief that the color of your skin makes you more deserving than the color of mine? The accusation hung in the air like a bomb. Other passengers began murmuring, some pulling out phones to record what was clearly becoming an epic confrontation. Bradley tried to recover, but the damage was done. Look, I didn't mean ... This is all a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, Marcus said firmly. You made it very clear what you think about people who look like me. You assumed I was poor, uneducated, and undeserving. You tried to have me removed from a seat I paid for on a plane I own because you thought your privilege trumped my rights. He turned to the flight attendant, who was now visibly shaking, and you enabled him. You were willing to move a paying customer to accommodate someone's bigotry and sense of entitlement. Do you think that's acceptable customer service? The flight attendant couldn't speak. Behind her, other crew members had gathered, clearly recognizing the magnitude of what was happening. Marcus pulled out his phone again. "Jennifer, it's me again. I need you to call David Patterson at the airline's corporate headquarters. Tell him we need an immediate meeting about our partnership agreement." He paused. "Yes, something happened on one of our aircraft that requires his personal attention." He hung up and looked around the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know that what you witnessed today is not representative of the service standards I expect on any aircraft in my fleet. This will be addressed at the highest levels." Bradley, realizing his world was crumbling, tried one last desperate move. "This is insane, you can't just ... I'll have my father call his lawyers." Marcus laughed, genuinely laughed. "Please do. I'd love to meet the legal team that thinks they can sue me for owning my own plane and refusing to be discriminated against on it." The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been asked to return to the gate for a passenger issue. We apologize for the inconvenience." As the plane taxied back, Marcus sat down in his original seat, the one he'd never actually left. Bradley remained standing, looking lost and humiliated as other passengers stared at him with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. The plane never took off that day. Bradley was quietly escorted off the aircraft by security, his threats and his family's connections suddenly seeming very hollow when faced with the reality of who he had tried to humiliate. The flight attendant was immediately suspended, and within 48 hours, the entire crew had been reassigned to retraining programs focused on customer service and anti-discrimination policies. But the real story was just beginning. The passenger videos from the flight went viral within hours. #SeatOwner and #PlaneOwner began trending worldwide as people shared their own experiences with discrimination and celebrated Marcus's calm, devastating response to Bradley's prejudice. Marcus eventually made it to Atlanta on one of his own jets, a sleek Gulfstream that made the commercial aircraft look modest by comparison. But the 3-hour delay had given him time to think about something much bigger than just this incident. Within a week, Skyline Corporate had announced the Dignity in Flight Initiative, a program that would monitor and score airlines based on their treatment of passengers regardless of race, appearance, or perceived social status. Airlines with poor scores would lose access to Skyline's aircraft leasing program, while those with excellent records would receive preferential rates. The airline that had hosted this disaster saw their stock price drop by 12% in the days following the incident as investors worried about the loss of their lucrative partnership with Skyline. They immediately implemented new policies and sensitivity training, but the damage to their reputation took years to repair. Bradley Whitmore III became more than just an internet meme. He became a cautionary tale taught in business schools about the cost of privilege and prejudice. His family's real estate company faced boycotts and lost several major contracts as clients questioned their values and judgment. Bradley himself was quietly removed from any public-facing roles in the family business. But perhaps the most powerful outcome was what happened next. Marcus used his platform to launch the Invisible Success movement, encouraging successful people of all backgrounds to occasionally travel, shop, and move through the world without the trappings of wealth. To better understand how society really treats people based on appearance alone, the most dangerous seat on any plane, Marcus would tell audiences at the corporate conferences where he was now a sought-after speaker, isn't in the cockpit during turbulence. It's the seat of judgment where people decide someone else's worth based on what they see on the surface. And the price of sitting in that seat isn't just embarrassment when you're wrong, it's the loss of your own humanity. The story spread far beyond aviation circles. It became a viral sensation not just because of the dramatic reveal, but because it resonated with millions of people who had faced similar discrimination, who had been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed because of how they looked or where people assumed they came from. Marcus Washington had done more than defend his right to a seat on a plane. He had created a moment that forced an entire industry and society at large to examine their unconscious biases and the assumptions they made about success, worth, and dignity. And every time someone shared the story, every time it was retold, it carried the same powerful message. Never judge someone by their appearance, because the quiet person in worn clothes might not just own the seat you're trying to take, they might own the entire plane you're sitting on. The moral of the story remains as powerful today as it was that Tuesday afternoon in Miami. Respect costs nothing, but the lack of it can cost everything. And sometimes, the person you underestimate is exactly the person who will teach you the most expensive lesson of your life. Remember, the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on their appearance or make assumptions about their worth, think about Marcus Washington and Bradley Whitmore. One walked away with his dignity intact and his empire stronger than ever, while the other learned that privilege without character is just an expensive ticket to humiliation. The question isn't whether you can afford to treat people with respect, it's whether you can afford not to.